Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and returning to the program today is the political theorist and analyst Benjamin Studebaker, recent PhD graduate of the University of Cambridge and the author of the brand new book, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. Benjamin Studebaker, thank you so much for joining us here on Current Affairs today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you about this book and hear what you think of it.
Well, I was delighted to get the book because I've followed your work for a long time. You have published in Current Affairs a few times, and so nothing delights me more than the idea of reading a book-length version of your thought. And you are one of my favorite people to read because I agree with a bunch of what you say and I disagree with a bunch of what you say, and you're just so much fun to grapple with. I think everyone should pick up this book because you will find, I don't think anyone agree with you on every point you make, but I think everyone will find it like intellectually enjoyable theory of what's going on that you put forward here. So let's try and explain the argument that you make in the book. You say, and I will just quote one way in which you summarize one of the core arguments of your book, which is you say that economic changes have driven the United States into a chronic legitimacy crisis. The crisis cannot be solved with reform or revolution and can only terminate in political despair. You talk about an unsolvable problem. Your book is about crisis of American democracy, although you differ in your assessment of what that crisis is from what a number of other people who talk about crises of American democracy. So let's start with, before we get to the kind of pessimism that, as I think, run through the book as a thread, let's try and explain first to us what you believe this chronic crisis is that plagues the United States.
Yeah, so in terms of the unsolvable problem, this is, I think, a set of economic changes that are gradually subjecting Americans of nearly every class and background to enormous amounts of economic stress. And I think these changes are really driven by rising capital mobility. It's easier to move money and jobs from place to place than it used to be. And this makes it harder for states to successfully tax wealth and income. And it makes it harder for states to maintain labor laws, wages, living standards. Companies can threaten to move their money overseas. Oligarchs can threaten to move their money overseas if they don't like a country's tax policy, if they don't like the wage policy, the regulatory policy. It's not that huge amounts of money are moving overseas necessarily, but this creates an incentive environment in which policymakers think that the way to grow the economy is to cut taxes, restrain wage growth, and deregulate the economy to make it more attractive to these rich people. Over time, this runs down the quality of the public services. It runs down the labor market protections for workers. And as people become more precarious in all sorts of ways, they become increasingly frustrated and they look for groups or people to blame. And I argue that there is a chunk of people out there, mostly who don't go to college, who are interpreting this through conspiracy theories, blaming minority groups, blaming immigrants, foreign populations, foreign countries. And then there's another population that goes to college that is blaming that first group for the problem, when really what's going on is that we have gradually since World War II, liberalized international trade, made it much easier for rich people to use capital mobility as a source of leverage. And that has gradually eroded the base for the welfare state, full employment state of the post-war era. And people are increasingly focused on cultural explanations, blaming different factions within society or different foreign population.
As excited as some of us may be to see small victories for the labor movement, like some stores unionizing here and there, some media companies unionizing, the Amazon labor union's victory in Staten Island, I take it that one of your points here, in fact, we have not seen the growth in union density, even despite these individual victories. And I take it that part of your analysis is that really we are in a situation in which the power of oligarchs is extremely, extremely difficult to challenge. And if we are hoping to see the rebirth, the restoration of prior levels of union density, that is going to be very, very, very difficult.
Yeah, it's baked into the international tax and trade system. That, I think, is the problem. The oligarchs have baked their power into the tax and trade system at a global level. And so while I think it's wonderful when unions make any kind of success, I am fervently pro-union. I support completely everything everybody's trying to do, the writers' strikes, people at Starbucks, all over the place. I think one of the fundamental problems here is that as a lot of industry has moved overseas, or automation has limited the number of workers who are actually needed in industry, most workers are not in a position to threaten the supply chain. They are in a position to maybe shut down a restaurant for some period of time. But what really made unions powerful in the post-war era is that they could shut down a steel plant or shut down an oil refinery and really do serious damage to the supply chain, cost rich people billions and billions and billions of dollars in just a few hours, just a few days. If you shut down a big old factory for any length of time, an enormous amount of money is lost. And even if you can, after a few weeks or a few months, find scabs to fill in, you're going to be out just a gigantic amount of money because you had a labor stoppage for any length of time. The unions that we have going, while it's good that we have people who are trying, are not really in a position to cause that kind of disruption. And because we have so much of this manufacturing going on in other places or with robots, our ability to extract concessions from capital with the strike has greatly diminished over the last 40 or 50 years.
Now, you said in your first answer there that one of the things that we are seeing is a great deal of economic stress that workers face, and even that a lot of people who would once have been successful professionals face, because they are now in the indentured servitude of student debt, and they are not reaching the level of comfort and security that they would have hoped to do. What is it, though, that makes it so difficult to redress this through the political system? We do live in what is nominally or ostensibly a democratic system where the people have a desire to change the policies. They theoretically have the right to get together and do so. So why doesn't that happen?
Yeah, so I think there are two sets of obstacles, one political, the other economic. The political obstacles are that within the professional class, I make a division between rump professionals, where the professionals were still able to live the decent lives that are envisioned when liberals talk about if you go to college, you'll have a ticket to life, and the fallen professionals, the D-class professionals who are now plunged into an economic situation more similar to traditional workers. One of the things that I think is very unhelpful is that fallen professionals have a tendency to want to hold on to the cultural capital they acquired when they went to college. They don't want to accept that they are proletarians, that they are workers, and they hang on to cultural differences between themselves and workers who don't go to college, and emphasize these differences when they get involved in political movements. So in my critique of the existing left, my argument is that these professionals have forced the left to develop in such a way that it alienates a lot of traditional workers. And I call this McGovernization, when left-wing movements become more interested in the cultural stuff or sometimes foreign policy stuff that professionals are interested in, at the expense of speaking directly to working class people in a way that they relate to, vibe with, are interested in getting involved with. At the same time, among those who don't go to college, there is a lot of vulnerability because there has been a collapse of the labor movement to a large degree, and a collapse, therefore, of the kinds of organizations that used to give workers good information about the economy and good information about what's going on. And so as a result of this, workers are more vulnerable to conspiracy theories, and they're more vulnerable to right-wing messaging that gets them involved in xenophobic narratives, blaming various minority groups or out-groups. So this has a kind of double effect. If the working class is blaming minorities and foreigners, and the professional class is differentiating itself from the working class by vilifying the working class for blaming immigrants and foreigners, then this pushes the fallen professionals and the workers away from each other. They repel along cultural and foreign policy lines, and that makes it difficult for them to cooperate on economic issues. Alongside all of this, we also have a lot of small business people, small employers, who are very stressed out because they run businesses that are fixed geographically. Unlike genuinely rich people, small business owners can't move their businesses or their money all over the place easily in response to economic stress. So when they're in local areas where things aren't going well, they freak out because they become concerned that they're not going to be able to keep going. And rich people are able to exploit this anxiety by going, hey, if we raise wages, you're the ones who are going to be put out of business, not us. Hey, if we raise taxes, you're the ones who won't be able to make it, not us. So a lot of the small business owners are also negatively affected by the economy, but their political action is entirely misdirected into supporting the very global economic system, which is gradually undermining the local economies that they rely on to survive. So that's the set of political obstacles. As far as economic obstacles go, we have the problem. If, let's say, we do manage to have a better kind of movement that is able to bring professionals and traditional workers together into one coalition, the issue is that movement has to win enough seats fast enough to credibly negotiate with other countries about the international system, about the tax system and the trade system. And the United States right now has major foreign policy credibility problems because presidents have not been able to get international treaties through the Senate, and presidents keep junking the treaties and agreements made by their predecessors. And so as a consequence of this, even if we do have a government that's interested in making major changes, a lot of other countries are going to be skeptical that we're credible negotiating partners, particularly, for instance, China, a country that we've been kind of antagonizing and being nasty with. They're not very likely to treat us as a credible trade partner. If we try to unilaterally revise the system by, say, bringing back big protective tariffs and sanctioning states that are rogue on tax and trade policy, that is going to disrupt supply chains. That disruption to supply chains boosts inflation, damages the economy, and makes it very difficult for political parties to get reelected. As we're seeing in Britain, Britain withdrawing from the European Union creates an economic malaise that makes it very difficult for any leader of the Conservative Party to stick, any political party to be popular for any length of time. So going unilateral is, I think, also a very fraught path.
Well, let me put this to you. You've mentioned that what you call the fallen professionals, that is the people who went to college but are still in sort of precarious positions. I mean, they tend to hold, of course, none of this holds absolutely, left-leaning beliefs. And you suggested in your answer there that it is difficult for them to work with members of the working class because they want to culturally differentiate themselves. Now, I want to be a little clearer on what you mean by that. And I also want to put to you the example of, we might argue, was the counterpoint that needs a response, which is that the Bernie Sanders campaign of 2016 and sort of 2020 was able to bring a lot of those people together. I know that Bernie Sanders' message resonated with a lot of working class people who liked Bernie, and it also resonated with a lot of these young fallen, what you call the fallen professionals, people with student debt, people in, obviously AOC was part of Bernie's campaign. I'm certainly in this group. He was able to kind of unify those things. So why would it then be doesn't seem to me so difficult to do?
So I was, of course, a big supporter of the 2016 Bernie campaign, as you know, and I wrote lots of pieces arguing for it, some stuff that did reasonably well. I think part of the issue is just as you say, sort of in 2020. What happened between 2016 and 2020? I think what happened is that in the left-wing organizations that got going after 2016, the professional voices crowded out the working class voices. And over time, a kind of insular tunnel thinking took over, where a bubble of professionals speaking too loudly to hear working class people gradually drowned out a lot of the working class voices that were in the movement and kind of alienated them and pushed them out. And we could see this in the 2020 campaign's performance. The 2020 campaign did much, much, much better in college towns and in some big cities like Las Vegas, but it did much, much, much worse in rural areas, in areas of lower average level of education. You know, when you talk about this, the professional class argument is, well, this is a racial thing. It's white people or men who are refusing to support the campaign. And I think this is a way of refusing to really grapple with the fact that it's predominantly people who don't go to college that were alienated by the new version of the Bernie campaign. It's people who don't speak this kind of language, aren't comfortable with this kind of terminology, for whom it's unfamiliar, and who see it as a kind of pretentious discourse that is meant to exclude them. And I think one of the things that's very difficult is that if you have any kind of organization where some of the people in the organization go to college and some of the people in the organization don't, one of the advantages that people who go to college have is an ability to dominate the conversation. Indeed, it might be the only advantage they have. They might make the same money. They might live in the same kind of place. Their kids may go to the same kind of school. They might even be materially worse off in the sense that they might have a lot of student debt. But when they're in the same organization, they are able to use language that they learned at university to really push past and run over working class people who might not be comfortable with those terms by emphasizing that the working class people who aren't comfortable with those terms need to educate themselves, need to learn, need to listen, need to do better. This is a language of basically saying, shut up and let us run the organization, shut up and let us run the campaign.
I've certainly, my dissertation was about the Democratic Socialists of America, and I interviewed many, many people within the organization, and I certainly did interview people who had not gone to college, who were part of DSA, who felt alienated by and talked down to by professionals within the organization. And in fact, DSA has done internal polling on the demographics of their membership, and it is massively disproportionately people with college degrees. It's actually massively also disproportionately white people. I mean, I have had someone explain to me that they felt very uncomfortable, multiple people explained to me that they have felt very uncomfortable in DSA spaces, and it's sometimes hard to even articulate exactly what it is. Because, you know, when asked to give kind of specific instances, it was a little hard to recall, for them to recall specific instances, but they, you know, in one case had just left the organization entirely because they felt that it was not a place for people who hadn't gone to college.
Yeah, and, you know, those are people who at least, you know, were still involved and were still trying to be involved. You know, that's a kind of, there's a little bit of an iceberg thing going on where those are the people that you would go and talk to because they're still involved, they're still peripheral. But there's a much larger number of people who left long ago or never joined because of this kind of stuff. And those are people who never get interviewed. And I talk a little bit in the book about what I call a kind of American subaltern, a set of people that nobody talks to, that nobody listens to, whose voices can't be heard. When they try to talk, they don't talk in the right way. They don't get the words right. They don't put things in the right order. They're not following the norms that we learn at university. And so they're not really able to articulate themselves in such a way that anybody listens, or if people do listen, nobody cares.
I want to draw a distinction here, though, that I think is quite important, because I think sometimes what you're saying gets interpreted as a kind of centrist almost, or Clintonian argument that, like, the working class are culturally conservative, and thus, in order to appeal to working class people, the left must abandon certain causes. I mean, you talked about governization, for example. Well, I think it's very difficult, actually, because if strong opposition to the atrocity of the Vietnam War is something that reduces the left's ability to be politically viable, I think it is very difficult because that is an issue of principle. Likewise, if we're talking about criticism of police brutality or immigration enforcement as things that are divisive or what have you, and we say, well, you'll never win the working class if you start talking about ICE or you start talking about reallocating police funding to social services. For me, I find it very hard to think that on matters of left principle, we should dial back what we believe in order to be politically viable. But I totally share the belief that speaking in alienating language and talking in ways that are contemptuous and treating people who aren't yet on your side as if they are deplorable and bigoted and beyond reason and reactionaries is no way to build a movement.
Yeah, I don't think that working class people are culturally right-wing necessarily either. I think for the most part, working class people are culturally moderate. I think they find a lot of the screaming that goes on unhelpful, counterproductive. And I have a substantial section in the book where I criticize the right for having this cultural obsession, which gets in the way of it doing any kind of real thinking about this problem. So I don't think that they're right-wing necessarily. What I do think is that we tend to talk about cultural stuff more, professionals do, for a couple of reasons. One is that rump professionals aren't really affected by the economic issues directly. They don't have a whole lot at stake in the economic issues. So rump professionals who are comfortable like to talk about foreign policy and cultural stuff because this stuff is more real to them. It's what's really meaningful in their lives. Economically, they've made it. They're fine. They don't really need the economy to change. So the tendency among that population is to just not care as much about economic issues. The fallen professional who's trying to be a rump professional, the fallen professional who would love to make it as a rump professional, is often trying to associate themselves with this rump professional model in much the same way that we talk about working class people who try to model themselves off after entrepreneurs or small business owners and imagine that they can make it in the economy by becoming small business owners. In the same way, fallen professionals try to model rump professionals and try to feel as if they're similar to rump professionals. They take cues from rump professionals. And as a consequence of that, there's a psychological benefit for fallen professionals in talking about the kinds of issues that rump professionals are talking about, in participating in the discussions that rump professionals are leading. When you're in the discussion that your professors are in, and you're in the discussion that the big names in tech are in, you feel like you are part of something important. And I think that causes a lot of fallen professionals to prioritize the cultural discussion. And I think that ultimately, all of the cultural problems that we're having are rooted in the economy and in the stress that is affecting people, in people's inability to cope with a society that is increasingly unstable, increasingly hostile to their interests. And so when we start talking about these cultural issues, for a lot of people, they're going, well, why aren't we talking about the stuff that I'm immediately facing? And so that's where I think it becomes an issue of priority. And the trouble with the fallen professionals is that the fallen professionals are just expending far too much of their time trying to be in a rump professional conversation. No matter how much we talk as if fallen professionals are rump professionals or are like rump professionals, they're not getting paid those kinds of salaries. They're not getting those kinds of roles. They're not in those kinds of jobs. They don't have the same interests, but they want to believe that they do. And for this reason, they keep talking about these issues that aren't going to solve the immediate economic problems that people face.
Well, hang on a minute. I talk about foreign policy because the threat of nuclear war would make all economic issues secondary. There's no economy if there's a giant third world war. I talk about abortion because the fundamental rights of women are not secondary. They're their first priority. We talk about trans rights because there is currently a very, very intense conservative effort to crack down upon, demonize, villainize trans people in this country. And we on the left believe in protecting minority groups from persecution and demonization and violence. You might call these cultural issues that are secondary to economic issues. I might argue that while economic issues should be at the top of our agenda, we should not classify things that affect some of the least well-off and most marginalized people in society as merely cultural.
Well, I would say first that in point of fact, it doesn't seem to be the case that a lot of desperately poor working class people are finding that these issues are central to them or their interests or concerns. That's why they're not getting involved. Secondly, I would say I think the reason that we're losing, and I think the right also experiences itself as culturally losing. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that both the left and the right feel that they're culturally losing. Part of the reason everybody's losing is that the cultural conversation gets worse when it's motivated by the kinds of resentments and pathologies that come out of extremely badly managed economy. I think that you need a good economic structure, you need economic justice to have a cultural conversation that is any good or that leads anywhere positive. Because people who are approaching the cultural conversation from a position of stress are going to be more antagonistic when they participate in a cultural space. They're not going to have the energy or the bandwidth to be empathetic or to be inclusive in their attitude. They're going to have a defensive posture because they're feeling economically like they're being screwed over. And when people feel like they're being screwed over, their impulse is to look for who's doing this to me, who's hurting me. They're looking for enemies, and they're susceptible and open to the idea that there are enemy groups in society that are targeting them. If we don't take care of the economic stuff first, I don't think that we're going to be able to get anywhere on culture or on foreign policy. And I also think that if we made the economic discussion better, we would also have better, our right-wing interlocutors would be more reasonable if they were under less economic stress. They would be easier to talk to and easier to argue with if they were not entering a conversation from that position. So I think the whole cultural conversation would get better if we really focused on the economic problem.
That might be true, but it seems to me that it's also the case that sometimes the enemies are real. When I see conservative political conferences, Michael Knowles, who's a prominent conservative commentator, just said that he, went to CPAC or one of these things and called for the elimination of transgenderism from society. Ron DeSantis just promised that he would eliminate leftism within 1 or 2 terms if he were the president. So I feel as if oftentimes these fears are not just displaced from people's economic stress, but they seem to be quite reasonable fears.
I think that a lot of this is bait. They want us to get into this conversation. And the right-wing media and the left-wing media, there's a set of political economy incentives to emphasize the fear stuff, because the fear stuff gets clicks and it gets attention and it gets votes. And I think that because of this, there is a symbiotic thing that goes on between certain parts of the right and certain parts of the left. I think you see this with AOC and Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance. I think very clearly these are two figures who are symbiotically terrifying one another's supporters in a way that is beneficial. I think nobody benefits Marjorie Taylor Greene more than AOC, and nobody benefits AOC more than Marjorie Taylor Greene. In a way, they are much closer together than they are apart because they rely on each other to manufacture this fear that motivates people to support the other side. And one of the goals of this book is to get us kind of out of this fear politics that I think took over during the Trump administration. Back in 2016, we had a hope politics. We were talking about trying to do Medicare for all and trying to do tuition-free college and trying to do infrastructure funding, a jobs guarantee, trying to make changes to the tax policy and the trade policy. Then during the Trump administration, we moved into this fear language where everybody is out to get us all the time. And everybody is saying this. But in point of fact, actual economic life in this country has not changed very much since 2016. It's gotten a little bit worse, I would say. It's gotten marginally worse over time, but it hasn't changed dramatically. And I think that ultimately, we have to kind of get out of this fear space and confront all of this as it is. And I think really we're in a kind of despair situation where the winner is Biden and it's the center. The center is benefiting from this scream fest that we're in.
Well, I'm with you part of the way here because I totally agree that a purely fear-based politics is bad. And I think that a lot of times the Democratic Party uses terrifying people about the Republicans to justify giving the voters absolutely nothing that will improve their lives. I mean, the entire Hillary Clinton platform in 2016 was essentially like, Donald Trump will destroy the country, so you should vote for me. However, I also think that many of the fears, as I've indicated before, are quite legitimate. After all, Donald Trump did indicate that if it were up to him, there wouldn't really be elections, or election results wouldn't be accepted if he didn't win them. That's a pretty scary thing, to go from having a system where each person accepts when the other person loses to having a system where each person totally delegitimizes the election and won't accept any result that is unfavorable, and would seemingly, if they had the power, abolish or not hold elections again. I mean, again, I feel like the fears are legitimate, but if you don't have the hopeful part, if you don't have the positive agenda, then, as you say, you are going to get stuck, and you're never going to address any of the things that actually in people's lives they ought to be the most afraid of.
Trump was in power for 4 years, and I don't think at any point in those 4 years he gave a toss about democracy. But that didn't enable him to abolish the democratic system or to stay on. I think what's come out over the last few years is a lot of evidence that our generals and officers would have arrested or shot him if he had, in fact, tried to stay on by force. He didn't have the level of support necessary in the military to stay on. And all of the Supreme Court justices voted to throw his case out, including Clarence Thomas, including the people he appointed. He couldn't get any Supreme Court justice to listen to what he had to say. So I think the military and the judiciary are very of a line on this. They're not going to let somebody like Donald Trump establish authoritarianism in the country. And I think part of what makes this crisis so interesting is that everybody says that the other side is trying to establish authoritarianism in the country, because nobody in the country wants authoritarianism, really, except maybe a couple of like right libertarian people like Brian Kaplan or Jason Brennan. I think nobody in the left or the right, the bulk of it, actually wants an authoritarian government. And so the most effective attack line, if you're right wing, is to say they're communists, they're Bolsheviks, they're Trots. And the most effective attack line on the left is to say they're fascists, they're authoritarians, they're trying to establish something like Franco or Pinochet. I mean, he'd love to be, sure, but that doesn't make it possible for him to do that. I think what we've seen is that even the hardline crazy people on the Supreme Court who are willing to throw out Roe v. Wade aren't willing to entertain an attempt by the sitting president to take the state. If those people who are willing to throw out Roe v. Wade, with all that has done to their legitimacy and their standing in the country, aren't willing to even give even one of them a vote to Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the election, I think that really indicates that there's an establishment in the courts and in the military that's not going to tolerate this stuff, as much as particular politicians might like the idea of being king. And I think probably throughout American history, most people who've been president have kind of fancied being king and might have gone for it if they could. We talk about what a virtuous thing it was for George Washington to stand down, because he could have gotten away with that. And we're kind of amazed that he did. We owe democracy in the country to a large degree to the fact that George Washington didn't make himself a king. It's kind of astounding that he didn't. The system doesn't rely on the virtues of the president. The system relies on the courts and the military not tolerating a president who gets a big head.
Well, what's interesting is that I think you even used the word in your book to describe the argument of your book that it's a little bit bleak. And in many ways, your central theory is pretty pessimistic about the possibilities for altering the economic structure that you see as being at the root of so many people's stress and misery. What you've just said there sounds a little bit hopeful and positive, because you're almost more optimistic than my own beliefs, because you actually think that the basic democratic institutions are pretty resilient. They're just, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, you can say what you think, they're pretty resilient. They're just incapable of solving any of the core problems.
See, I think that's almost more horrifying. If there were revolutionary factions that were threatening American democracy with the deluge, that would put pressure on the political establishment to make changes. If there was real fear in the establishment that there could be a coup, if there weren't major changes made to the economy to get people to feel better about the state of things, if there were, Bolsheviks, out, trying to do Bolshevik things, there would at least be a little bit of concern on the part of the establishment. And they might give us a cookie, they might give us something. We got Social Security, because they were scared of the Soviets. And because in the 30s, everyone was terrified of that. But because there isn't any viable alternative to this system that anybody believes in, they are completely calm. They're so calm that they can get us all worked up and terrify us without worrying at all that this will actually result in the fall of the state. And they're just playing us for suckers by making us think that we're in this kind of 30s type situation or 1848 type situation or late Soviet 80s type situation. It's a game they play to get us to participate in politics when they're not going to give us anything in return for doing it. What really concerns me is that this is just going to go on and on and on. And life in the country is just going to gradually get worse as the government becomes less able to act. And that what this will do is it will plunge us all into despair, into a kind of really deep despair. And I wonder if the part of me that wants to find something positive in this goes, well, maybe despair can be generative. Maybe if we get out of fear and we have this confrontation with how horrible this system is becoming and how difficult it is to get it to do anything, we might get more creative and more outside the box and try things we've not tried before, things that might actually get our government a little bit concerned about us and cause it to maybe offer us something in return for continuing to support it. Legitimacy is all about getting the government to give you stuff in return for your support for it. And if your support for it is unconditional, then the government doesn't have to give you very much, and it can treat you in an increasingly heavy-handed and nasty way. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a government that's not very worried about the population, thinks it can psychologically manipulate the population to any purpose that it wants, and is increasingly doing just that.
Well, let me ask you to clarify what you think it is that is even the minimal goal that we cannot reach or that seems beyond us. You said there something that sounds like it should be reasonably achievable, which is to have a government that is basically responsive to the needs and desires of the people. I assume that not every government in the history of humanity has failed to meet that criterion. It seems like that should be something that we can do.
I think part of what has always made, insofar as democracy works, it works in part because there's a little bit of fear on the part of the professionals who tend to occupy the central offices in a democracy. There's a little bit of fear that the system might go down the tubes. If they're not careful, if they don't take care of different populations in society that have different needs, that there might be a coup, that the system might actually fail or collapse. And I think what has happened is that the rump professionals who play a leading role in this society and the oligarchs who pay them are not really concerned about all of that. And because they're not concerned about all of that, our democratic institutions don't function very well. I think democracy doesn't work if there isn't actually an alternative system in the background that can actually terrify the elite who run the country, not the ordinary people. They can be terrified by all sorts of things. But the elite who run the country, they actually have to be worried. And I think what we've seen in the Biden administration is that they are not at all worried. Because if the Biden administration were worried, it would have actually, when it had a majority, given us real, meaningful policy reforms. And when Biden was elected, there were all these people who came out. They said, we're going to push Biden to be the most progressive president ever. Biden understands this is his FDR moment, that we need to do things economically to prevent Trump from getting back in. And what's just happened? Biden has just frozen federal spending for a whole year in an election year. He's frozen federal spending at a time when inflation is 4 or 5%. And then he's only going to do a 1% increase in spending the following year, when inflation, similarly, maybe 3 or 4%. And what that means is there's going to be a huge amount of austerity in an election year when the front runner is Donald Trump. Now, to me, that says that the Biden administration doesn't care if Donald Trump beats it. It's not at all worried about that. It really is not any kind of concern for this elite. They don't actually think that Donald Trump can hurt them. And I don't think it's just that they think Donald Trump can't win. I think their experience in having Donald Trump as president is that while they don't particularly like it, it's annoying, they can figure that out. They can deal with that. They can manage it. As we've seen in a lot of these countries where these kinds of people get in, like Berlusconi in Italy. The Italian elite They were annoyed with Berlusconi. They didn't like him. They tried to get him out with a lot of different corruption scandals and legal challenges. But ultimately, they were able to deal with him, and the Italian political system outlasted Berlusconi. It remains a totally gridlocked system that can't do anything, and living standards in Italy have plunged continuously. And it just gets worse and worse and more miserable. And, crazy left-wing and crazy right-wing factions, and crazy centrist factions get in Italy. And none of them do anything because none of them can actually pull Italy out of the euro or out of the European Union. That would be nuts. That would destroy the economy, right? But of course, if you stay in the European Union, you can't do anything. So the cultural conflict in Italy just gets more and more intense. The democracy just keeps going and nothing ever happens. And it just gets more and more miserable. And I think that we're going this way. We're just becoming more and more miserable with no end in sight. I would like there to be an end in sight. So I'm trying to alert people to this problem. Because I think if we get out of the fear and we just get into despair, just for a little bit, just really look at it with despair, maybe we'll start to be more creative. Because I think when we're not in despair and we try to go back to hope, we start trying to convince ourselves that stuff's going to work that really isn't going to work. Like we talk all the time about introducing European reforms, proportional representation or third parties or whatever. But like the European democracies that are the most like us in terms of wealth, in terms of culturally, Germany, the Netherlands, countries like that. These countries are not dominated by left-wing supermajorities. The left-wing party in Germany is a weak, pathetic party that hasn't achieved anything for working people in Germany in decades. The party that usually prevails in the system is the Christian Democratic Union. Similarly, in the Netherlands, you get these 6 or 7 party coalitions. They never deliver any kind of major left-wing reform. Proportional representation prevents right-wingers from gutting the welfare state in these countries completely. But when the left is willing to participate in gutting this stuff, as the SDP in Germany was when they did the Hartz reforms and imposed the flexible labor market so that Germany would have the export advantage over the Southern European countries. When the left's willing to do that, nobody stops it. So I don't really see any of this stuff making a difference. In my book, I kind of gave Luke Savage a hard time, which I feel bad about because I think he's a good guy. But, he made an argument after Nina Turner lost in Ohio that this is because of dark money. But he's also written pieces where he's pointed out in countries where there's good, strong campaign finance law, that's not enough. That doesn't actually enable you to do these reforms. Those countries are, if anything, continuing to drift to the right, maybe a little bit slower than us, but that's the way they're going. And so I just think we really need to get outside the box and think a lot bigger than we have been. And that's what I'm hoping this book will do. I'm hoping it will just kind of shake people out of this horrible post-Trump period that we've been in.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't accept the ultimate kind of bleak conclusion to your book. And to your credit, your final chapter, considers the possibility that there are paths out. I want to go to that part where you cite Luke Savage, because this is the part that feels like almost a critique of me personally. Because you say some people's jobs depend on the idea of a viable American left. These people work in politics, they work for campaigns, they write for progressive and socialist newspapers and magazines. They publish books with left-wing presses. Yep, check. They run podcasts. Check. And they're the professional left. For these people, the argument I'm making about the American left directly challenges the value of their work. It may threaten their jobs and livelihood. They have an incentive to resist it. They need to maintain hope. And so they adopt increasingly strained positions. Then, to justify the argument that the positions are increasingly strained, you say, let's give the example of Nina Turner. Now, you have pointed out in the book that for all of people's excitement about DSA candidates and the squad, these people tend to win in very, very deep blue districts, which does not suggest that we are on the cusp of a radical left-wing movement sweeping the country. You point out that when Nina Turner ran in a special election in 2021. It was a district where Hillary Clinton had gotten 80% of the vote, and the left ran Nina Turner, former co-chair of Sanders' campaign, president of Our Revolution, and she lost 50 to 45%. And so you say, how can this have happened? This undermined the left strategy. It challenged its narrative. And then you cite Luke saying, well, it was a bunch of dark money. To me, though, I wouldn't say what Luke said. I would say, well, she lost 50 to 45%. It's a 5% difference. It's, It could have gone the other way, and if it had, then it wouldn't, we'd be telling a different story. And that's a very, very small difference to use as a case to show that, well, the left is not viable in this country. It takes a long time. We got to run more candidates. We got to look at what the Turner campaign did wrong, and it may just be that if Nina Turner had done a few things differently, it would have been 50 or 45% the other way. I mean, to me, the argument is not, you say the left is a hope industry, it's giving all these people these false hope. Well, I run a socialist magazine, and I don't try and give people false hope, but what I try and do is go, okay, look, we lost this one, we won this one, and now we've got to sit back and reevaluate and say, why did we lose that one? Why did we lose this one? How do we get step by step by step to building a viable movement? And if we're not winning in anything other than deep blue districts, why is that? Let's ask the question. Let's not have false hope. But I don't see, as someone who is part of this professional left, it's true that I have an incentive to resist your argument, but I also think I have factual grounds to resist your argument, because I don't think I'm selling false hope. I think I'm selling realistic hope.
Well, there's always the possibility of being a class trader on this point. You don't have to do what everybody who has the same economic interests would do. So my hope is that maybe I can persuade you here. Here's what I would say. Yes, it's true that Nina Turner didn't lose the primary by altogether that much. If she had won, she would have joined a small group of members of Congress, all of whom are in not just very blue districts, but gerrymandered blue districts that really shouldn't exist. Very, very few of the people who have been elected to Congress have won outside of that kind of district. So what that says to me is that we have a major structural problem. And I think part of the trouble is that when you do have some number of people winning, those people tend to be the experienced people. They're the cadre. They're the people that, by necessity, because they have experience, you're going to go to when you try to run other places. And these people have learned all the wrong lessons from running successful campaigns in weird districts that aren't representative of the country. So I think that's one problem. Secondly, the stuff that you have to do to win a heavily gerrymandered blue district, when it gets national news or national attention, it is easy for the right to try to use that to paint you as somebody that shouldn't be supported nationally in other kinds of places. There are negative incentives in Democratic primaries, especially in Democratic primaries in bright blue places, to take positions that cater to professional class voters. Very often in these districts, you have big universities, you have a lot of students, and so there's big incentive to amplify the professional voice in those campaigns. So when they win, they create this illusion that by amplifying the professional voices, we're going to get somewhere nationally. And so I think when they win, they're Pyrrhic victories because they set us back overall. The Nina Turner case, I think, is especially interesting because if you're going to win with that strategy, that's the kind of place you should win. And in that case, Nina Turner didn't even win. So, but even if Nina Turner had won, that would have just further validated this strategy that is only competitive in these weird gerrymandered blue districts. And yes, it takes a long time to build a movement, and it takes a long time to win elections. But we're also at this point like 8 years removed from 2016. We got climate change, and our culture is progressively getting worse as the economy subjects people to more and more stress. And on a lot of issues, the country is sliding in the direction of more and more miserable, more and more agonistic. It's getting worse. And so I don't see the situation as getting better for the left over time. I see it as getting worse because the more economically miserable people are, the more they gravitate to friend-enemy distinctions, hateful messaging, hateful frames, the more powerful a lot of the right-wing rhetoric becomes. And so I think that we don't have unlimited time here. And if I saw evidence that the left was learning these lessons and was trying to run the kinds of campaigns that I thought were more competitive, that would be a positive thing. I would still think there are certain things we have to worry about. If we win, what then happens? But I would probably shut up about those things like I did during 2016 and go, yeah, go guys, right? But that's not what's happening. Nobody's learning any of these lessons. And we keep doing more and more election cycles, and it's not changing. It's just getting worse. And this is really, we're running out of time. We're all going to get old and we're all going to die. When you started Current Affairs, I loved how you talked about New Republic and Mother Jones and what had happened to them. I really don't want this to happen to us where we hit a wall because we get too focused on the professional class and its goals. which is what happened to the previous generation of left-wingers. And then, we become afraid of the Republicans winning. And so we just end up writing stuff that can get used by the center to stay in power.
Yeah, well, that is a real danger. I mean, I genuinely do not want Republicans in power for a number of reasons. And so I find myself, I'm frustrated with how much of my time seems to be spent. My latest book is responding to right-wing arguments. I would much rather be making the positive case for socialism. You said there that we don't have unlimited time, but part of what you argued seems to imply that we have more time than we might think. Because as you say, the system is more, you've argued that we aren't in as much danger of lapsing into dictatorship within the next 4 or 10 years as we might think. So it seems to me that the conclusion that I come to from your book is not really so much that the way is shut, but that we are really on the left. I think a lot of the critiques that you've made, especially you talk about how when AOC got into office, she stopped talking about Medicare for all and started having fights on Twitter with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I think because there's no real obvious way to advance the left's agenda, and you point out how candidates end up selling false hope, and I think that's really, really important, that analysis. But to me, I do not come away with the conclusion, well, there's very little we can do and this is going to get worse and worse. I think, okay, look, it is clear. I think you are right that we don't have a strategy here. And I do take it as a challenge. I take your book as a challenge to think, okay, well, how do we take what was good about Bernie 2016, which nearly worked? That nearly worked. It came close to working. I feel like if Bernie had done a few things differently, he might have won that primary. So what do we do to get that kind of message, to get those kinds of powerful candidates that can speak to a really, really broad swath of people? And I think you lay out pretty clearly here what we shouldn't do, which is sell people on false hope.
Yeah, I think Bernie in 2016, I thought it was a really great candidacy. I think that the trouble is that the incentives for these movements are not going in the right direction. Once these movements get going, the economic incentives start to set in. There are a lot of great projects that when they start are really great, and they're started by people with really positive intentions. But there's this gradual effect insofar as the professionals, given time, will tend to crowd out the workers in these spaces through the use of the language. And then over time, because the economy is getting worse and people are getting more miserable and more stressed out, our capacities are eroding. Our ability to be strategic is getting less over time. We are having to focus more on what psychologically makes us feel better about the situation. There is a kind of need for coping that gets stronger the more miserable the situation gets. And that,
I want to ask you about that, because you talk about the need for coping and the fandoms and the things people retreat into.
Yeah, for sure. So in the book, I talk about the 4 Fs, faith, family, fandoms, and futurism, as these kind of zones into which people go when they get sick of politics and they can't stand it anymore. They try to withdraw from it and get involved in something else. And I think part of the trouble is that when you try to go into something else, this public-private distinction that liberals like to drop is not a very robust distinction. In practice, what goes on in the public sphere inevitably infects the private sphere, and attempts to get away from the public into the private can't actually get you out. In the faith space, I think one thing that we've seen very clearly is that professionals who aren't able to make it in straight politics go into the faith space and try to politicize the faith space as a way of having the political influence that they couldn't have through straightforwardly being in politics. Or sometimes it's other careers. Kenneth Copeland used to be a singer, but he couldn't really make it as a singer, so he became a religious professional and used that to try to have fame and influence and money that he couldn't have just by being a singer. I think there are a lot of people who go into the faith space for that reason. And as a result of this, we're seeing that people are getting tired of religion. Working class people in particular are still often people of faith, but they don't like to go to church. They don't really like the professional preachers who increasingly dominate the faith spaces. And if you look at which churches are the most politically active, which churches are doing political activity as a church, increasingly the statistics suggest that it's churches that skew progressive that are more active than the conservative churches, as a lot of rank and file members of the faithful become tired of these conservative preachers who are not really helping them in any kind of meaningful way. I think the same thing is likely to happen in those progressive churches, insofar as I think a lot of those progressive preachers are also not really leading them toward any kind of constructive solution. Then when it comes to family, we have the problem of a lack of economic base for family models. And I don't just mean the nuclear family here. I mean every kind of way of constructing a household are increasingly difficult to build, difficult to maintain. A lot of this system leans on, hey, you can't find a good role for yourself in society, but you can find a partner, you can find love, you can find somebody to be with. That increasingly is very, very difficult for people. And some of this results in a kind of skepticism about the family. Some of it results in people trying to make families and failing. People going through cycles of cheating, cycles of abuse. We're constantly talking about how dysfunctional our relationships are and our families are. And I think that's downstream from the economy. The economy is making it very, very difficult for people to build stable household units of whatever kind. Then, when it comes to fandoms and when it comes to futurism, I think people start looking to companies to fulfill them in place of the state. So these hierarchical firms like Disney or Elon Musk as a Tesla oligarch, these figures and firms have become things people believe in more than the government itself. And so they're investing their life in what kind of Marvel movies will be out and what kind of Star Wars movies will be out. And whether maybe one day they'll get to go to Mars, or in cryptocurrency, newfangled, non-fungible tokens, future things. And these are, the futurism is, I think, really pernicious because it is a kind of libidinal investment in the market economy and in what the market economy can deliver, if not now, then in the future. And I think it also afflicts the left, insofar as a lot of people on the left imagine that markets will eventually deliver a situation where they can win if markets are allowed to run their course. There's a certain kind of accelerationist Marxist who thinks that if you just keep letting markets run their course, eventually they'll make things better. I think generally they'll make things worse. They'll stress people out and make them less able to be solidaristic and cooperative with one another. And then when it comes to the fandoms, increasingly all of the cultural struggles that we have in the public sphere are in the fandom. They're in conversations about Disney movies. They're in conversations about sports. And the ordinary person who just wants sports to be fun and doesn't want to have to think about all of this stuff, has no home anymore. And the same goes for movies. There's no way of engaging with this stuff without political content. And maybe it was always a bit silly for people to think that they could do sports in a non-political way or that they could do movies in a non-political way. But I think it is foreclosing more of the spaces that people use to get psychological relief from the public sphere. And so that means that now they're not just being stressed out by the economy or by political messaging. They're also being stressed out by the fact that the new movies are not the movies they want, that the new television shows aren't the shows that they want, that, Henry Cavill is fighting with Lauren Hisrick or whatever it is. These things are further stressing people out. Instead of getting relief from thinking about the stuff that they're fans of, they're getting pulled back into the same conversations that don't lead them toward economically organizing.
Well, I haven't read a book in a long time that has challenged my thinking as much as this book. The book is The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. The Way is Shut by Dr. Benjamin Studebaker, available from Palgrave Macmillan. Benjamin Studebaker, thank you so much for joining us today on Current Affairs.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with you.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.